In this lecture, we're going to start writing an animation. The animation we're going to go for is a zoom animation. If the element is entering the document, it'll zoom into place. If the element is leaving the document, it'll zoom out. JavaScript is more than capable of handling this sort of animation efficiently. There's a myth that JavaScript is slower than CSS animations. That's not entirely true. There's an API called Web Animations. It's a new API that allows us to perform animations efficiently. It's even more efficient than CSS. It's a newer API that's unrelated to Vue. However, we can use this API with Vue. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Web Animation API. It's still a fairly new API. I don't expect many of you to be aware of it. This will be a great time to get started with the API. Let's use it with Vue. We'll start with the enter animation. Switch back to the editor. Search for the enter function. The first step to using the Web Animation API is to select an element. An animation can only be played on an element. This requires us to make a selection. Typically, we would use the query selector or getElementById functions to select an element. We don't need to do that since the hook functions are provided with the element. We'll call the animate function on the element object. There's one thing I want to be clear about the element object. The element object we're working with is a normal DOM object. We have full access to the element's properties and methods. The animate function exists only on DOM objects, so it's not specific to Vue. The animate function will animate the element it's being called on. It has two arguments. The first argument is an array of properties to animate. The enter event runs whenever an element is inserted into the document. The properties we're going to animate will zoom the elements in. In the array, we're going to add two objects. Each object can be filled with CSS properties we'd like to add to the element. JavaScript will take care of transitioning between the properties. It'll apply the properties in the first object to the element. It'll then apply the properties in the second object. If we want, we can add as many objects to the array as we'd like. There's no limit. We're going to keep the animation simple. We'll have two objects, one for initial properties of the element, another for the properties the element should have when the animation is over. In the first object, we'll add the transform property. Its value will be the following: scale 3D 0, 0, 0. The scale 3D function will change the scale of the element. That'll make it look really small. We're attempting to make a zoom in animations. It makes sense for the element to be small. We want the element to grow in size. That's what we'll handle next. In the second object, we'll leave it empty. We're finished with the animation. The default scale for an element is 100%. We don't need to scale it back to its original size. The browser will assume we want the element to be its original size. The animate function will set the initial state of the element using the properties we have in the first object. It'll slowly transition the element's CSS properties from the first object to the second object. There's a second argument we can pass onto the animate function. It's an object of settings. This will allow us to change how the animation behaves from the duration to iterability. We're going to set the duration property to 1000. The duration will tell the browser how long to play the animation. The duration must be in milliseconds. The animation we're creating will last for 1 second. We're not going to configure the animation further. This will give us the effect we're looking for. The next step is to tell Vue when the animation is complete. As far as Vue knows, the animation can be playing forever. We can tell Vue the animation is finished by using the done function. However, we don't want to call it until the animation is complete. The animate function will return an object with events we can listen for. Let's assign the animate function to a variable called animation. Then, below it, we'll set the onFinish function to an arrow function. The onFinish event gets emitted when the animation is finished. The value for this must be a function that'll be called when the animation is complete. Inside this function, we'll call the done function to let Vue know we're finished. That'll do it for the enter animation. Let's work on the leave animation. It's going to be the same code. We can copy and paste the code from the enter method to the leave method like so. There's one modification we'll need to make to get the opposite effect. We'll reverse the order of the objects in the array for the animate function. Alright, let's give things a test. Refresh the browser and try pressing the button. The heading will zoom in and out based on the flag property. This animation works great, but we can further optimize it. Vue prefers that you use CSS animations over JavaScript animations. Because of this, Vue will check if you have a CSS animation for the transition. If you don't, it will use your JavaScript animation. Because of this, your animation takes up more resources than it has to. We can tell Vue directly we don't have a CSS animation. Go back to the editor. Inside the transition component with the JavaScript animation, we can bind a property called CSS. We'll set it to false. This property will instruct Vue not to check for a CSS animation. It'll skip right onto using the JavaScript animation. A very simple way to make your animations more efficient and faster. Aside from that, you should be good to go. That's how you can use JavaScript animations in your application.